Hello everyone, I am Dr. Sahabuddin Ahamed, Assistant Professor, Guest Faculty in the Department of English at Pandit Sundarlal Sharma Open University, Bilaspur, Chhattisgarh, India. Welcome you all to this virtual session. Today I will be speaking on Orientalism. Orientalism is a groundbreaking concept introduced by the critic and author Edward Said in his 1978 book Orientalism. Through this presentation, I will explain how Orientalism emerged as a Western framework for representing the East, how Orientalism shaped colonial power, uneven cultural representation, and why this book remains important today. By the end of this session, dear learners, you will have a clear understanding of Edward Said's contribution to postcolonial theory, the Orientalist discourse, the relevance of Orientalism in contemporary humanities and social sciences. Now, to begin with Edward Said's book Orientalism, this book is often considered a foundational text in postcolonial studies. The book is seen as a starting point of postcolonial studies. The book was first published in 1978. In this book, Edward Said examines how the West, Europe, America represents, construct, studies the East and Islam. Said argues that this construction representation is not objective, not neutral, but political and ideological. The book supports domination and reinforces stereotypical and dehumanized portrayals of people from the East, especially the Arab world, the Islamic world, the Far East, the Near East. The book displays how ideologically motivated the Orientalism and its representation distorts and controls the East, the Orient by showing West's political hegemony over the Orient. In addition, the book constructs the knowledge, how knowledge becomes a tool of oppression, domination. The book defines, controls, rules others, non-European peoples. The book critiques Western representations, meaning the book challenges how the West has historically presented the East. The book exposes ideological bias, meaning Western depiction representation of the East is rooted in dominant assumptions, Eurocentric assumption. The book unveils links between cultural representation, power, geography and knowledge. The book raises some critical questions about how colonialism, imperialism, racism operate and how they construct the East as culturally other. The book encourages reconstructing cultural narratives, meaning to revise narrative that misrepresent Eastern Oriental cultures, societies, peoples. The key arguments of Orientalism are: Orient is a Western construction, the West portrays the East or the Orient as exotic, weak, irrational and inferior. This portrayal strengthens Western cultural and political supremacy over the Orient. So, in this way, Orientalism is represented in academic discourse, literature. Now, let us talk about the author and thinker Edward Said. Edward Said was a Palestinian American scholar, critic and influential post-colonial thinker. He was one of the most influential thinkers of the late 20th century. Said was born in Jerusalem, Palestine in the year 1935. And as a result of partition of Palestine, he became a refugee and he later moved to Cairo Later he attended schools in Jerusalem and Cairo. He received higher education and he earning BA from Princeton University. Subsequently he completed PhD from Harvard University. Following his academic training and career, Said became a professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University. In addition, he held visiting professorships at Harvard, Yale, Stanford and Johns Hopkins University. Throughout his career, Said published several works, among them Beginnings, Intention and Method, published in 1975, Orientalism, his most influential work that transformed the field of post-colonial studies, The Question of Palestine, The World, The Text and the Critic, and his another important work is Culture and Imperialism, published in 1993. This book is a significant work on imperial discourse and cross-cultural perspectives. Said's contribution to contemporary thought emerges from the interactions of his personal history, intellectual training and political commitments. For example, his experience of Palestinian displacement shaped his critique of dominant cultural narratives. So, in his work, Said was influenced by Michel Foucault's concept of discourse and Antonio Gramsci's notion of hegemony. He involved in Palestinian politics for the country's independence. Consequently, Said became one of the foundational figures in post-colonial studies. Said offered an anti-colonial perspective in his work. Said challenged the Western concept of the Eastern culture and society. Said provided the base for the development of the field of post-colonial studies. Now, his legacy continued to shape global debates on culture, power, representation and the relationship between them. Now, turning to what is Orientalism. So, Orientalism refers to the way in which Western world studies, construct, represents the Orient or the East. It represents the East as exotic, backward, inferior, pagan and fundamentally different from the West. Moreover, Orientalism operates through stereotypical and reductive images of representation of non-European cultures world, and it rejects non-European cultural complexity and diversity. Consequently, such representation justify imperial presence in the Oriental societies. In Said's term, Orientalism functions as a Western style for dominating, restructuring and having authority over the Orient. Furthermore, this Orientalist discourse becomes visible across various cultural forms. For example, we find paintings of harems, deserts, snake charmers in literature, travel writings, and such writing presents the East or the Orient as a mysterious and uncivilized world. Stereotypical portrayals of the Islamic world, Arab world and Indians. So, such a representation reinforcing the ideas of cultural difference and inferiority, superiority. In this way, the Orient is constructed, it is now a real entity. Orientalism serves the political goals of the West, thus Orientalism is seen as a discourse rather than a simple set of images or stereotypes. Now, let us focus on historical background and origins of the concept Orientalism. This slide traces the historical roots of Orientalism by situating it within the broader context of European colonial expansion. For example, from the late 18th century to the early 20th century, European powers like Britain, France, Portugal, Italy, Spain not only occupied eastern countries, that is Middle East, North Africa, Asia, but also produced knowledge about these countries, about the East, and such ideology justifies colonization of these countries. So, such a representation become aligned with the structures of colonial authority. European colonizers, scholars, writers constructed the East as fundamentally different from the East, and East as inferior, and East is in need of Western education and control. So, there emerged European colonial superiority. For example, Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, followed by scholarly works, because scholars wanted to sort, map, classify Egyptian society, and the political survey of Indian continent. So, it is from their belief that the Western knowledge is needed, education is needed in the Eastern countries, Eastern societies. That is why colonial authority, colonial education. Now, moving on to the next slide, Orient and Occident binary opposition. Orientalism is based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction between the Orient and the Occident. It is how the Orient and Occident are discursively represented in literature and media as binary opposites. The Occident, the West, is represented as rational, modern, self, moral, good, progressive, civilized and developed, Christian, changing. In contrast to the Occident, the Orient or the East is represented as other, exotic, savage, irrational, uncivilized, backward, unchanging, strange, underdeveloped, cruel, criminal, seductive, lazy and so on. So, there is an essentialized difference that overlook the diverse native cultures and complexity. So, there is such cultural hierarchy in the construction of presentation of Orientalism. In this way, European identity was constructed because of the East. For example, colonial discourse claiming that Indians are incapable of self-governance. That is why Indian need Western administration, education and so on. Films and media portray Arabs as violent or uncivilized, exotic. Literature and culture reinforce and repeating such biases and stereotypical images about the East of the East. I would like to discuss latent Orientalism. Edward Said distinguishes between two types of Orientalism. First, latent Orientalism refers to the unconscious assumptions that shape Western attitude towards the East. Moreover, latent Orientalism reflects inherent cultural stereotypes, misconceptions that remain embedded within Western structures, Western cultures. In addition, these invisible biases sustain ongoing misrepresentations of Eastern culture. Furthermore, such beliefs are passed down across generation. Consequently, they remain linked to colonial administration, domination, authority. For example, Orientalist assumptions portray the East as mystical. Eastern women are depicted as naturally submissive. Eastern religion are inherently superstitious. Now, coming to manifest Orientalism. According to Said, manifest Orientalism refers to explicit, visible, stereotypical cultural representations of the East found in various texts. Moreover, it includes direct statements about the Orient, about the East that reinforces biased presentation. Consequently, such representation sustain misrepresentation of Eastern cultures and societies. So, such representation is seen in literature, travel writing, media portrayals, film, policies. Furthermore, it is closely linked to colonial domination, authority. It legitimizes unequal power relations. For example, these representations appear in literature, travel writing, where the East is often depicted as exotic, other and inferior subject. Arabs are naturally violent, Indians are depicted childlike natives, when media calling Middle East societies as tribal. Now let us examine Orientalism as discourse. So dear learners, Edward Said's theory of Orientalism is based on Michel Foucault's notion of discourse. So it exhibits the discursive construction of the Orient by European writers and colonizers, meaning it is a system of ideas, representation and practices that creates meaning. Said argues that this dominant construction of Eastern cultures and peoples through archaeology, literary text, history, music, arts, political theory, anthropology, films, media, integral to the conquest and domination of the East, because colonial project requires these kinds of discourses to support and justify colonization. It enabled Europe to show its military power, intellectual power, domination over the East, and it emphasized the subjugation, control of the East. Consequently, colonial policies are academic intellectual discourses. For example, encyclopedias defining the East as passive or inferior, Hindu and Islamic traditions and belief systems are misrepresented within the Eurocentric discourse as pagan, primitive and different. White man's burden narrative used to justify colonial intervention in the Eastern societies. The East often portrayed as needing to be civilized, governed and developed. Now this slide talks about knowledge and power relationship. Edward Said draws inspiration from Michel Foucault's idea that power and knowledge are interconnected. According to him, producing knowledge about the East gives the West the power to define, categorize and ultimately control it. Knowledge production is closely tied to political power. How? Because knowledge is not natural or neutral or objective, but it is used to justify, define, control, support colonial rule. Moreover, representation produced through academic writing, institution, text and legitimize power and public perception and influence foreign policy. For example, schools, museums, colonial offices systematically shaped Orientalist views. Similarly, British rule in India justified through the narrative of a civilizing mission. Furthermore, US foreign policy has been framed through Orientalist media narratives in the postmodern world. Now turning to the Orientalism in literature. So literary texts often function as a carriers of imperial ideology. Literary texts shape the images of the East and support the domination of the East. Orientalist texts exaggerate exotic customs, emphasize sensuality, cultural difference. Moreover, literary texts frequently emphasize such notions of cultural representation. In addition, it highlights narrative authority by Western writers who have colonial viewpoints in their text. For example, William Shakespeare's play Othello, this play represents the Moor as exotic, abuser, passionate, culturally other, violent. So it reinforcing stereotypes about Eastern cultures, African identities. Othello is admired yet distrusted by the West. Another literary work, Rudyard Kipling's Scheme. This work presents India as mysterious and India is dependent on British guidance. Gustav Flaubert writing portrays Egypt as erotic, exotic, reinforcing Orientalist fantasies imagination to the West. Furthermore, various translations of Arabian Nights exaggerate sensuality fantasy, constructing the Middle East as mysterious and exotic world. Now let us look at the next slide, Orientalist projects. Dear learners, Orientalist projects emerged as systemic efforts through which Western scholars, colonizers, writers, administrators constructed knowledge about the East. Disciplines like maps, political theories, dictionaries, text, ethnographies, institutionalized Orientalist views. Orientalists like William Jones, Jacob Grimm, Franz Bopp and many others studied, interpreted Eastern cultures through a dominant Eurocentric lens, Western lens. Many academic fields constructed biased Western frameworks. Consequently, they reinforced Western authority in such framework representations. They shaped educational systems, administrative policies and cultures of the East through such representation and frameworks. Ultimately, they legitimized imperial dominance authority by presenting the Orient as an object to be studied, governed and developed and controlled. Now focusing on criticism of Orientalism. While Edward Said's book Orientalism is a widely respected theory, is widely read, influential, the book has also received lot of criticism. Some scholars argue that Said oversimplifies Western scholarship by treating it as a simple, unified discourse. Others claim that Said does not truly address the internal diversity within Eastern culture societies. He underestimates Eastern agency as he portrays Eastern societies primarily as a victim of Western representation. The book also overlooks the issue of indigenous complicity and internal class dimension. Moreover, the book has ignored gendered nature of colonial discourse. Some critics argue that Said has ignored cross-cultural scholarship between the East and the West. The book leans towards historical reductionism, that means it simplifies complex historical interactions. So, critics like Bernard Lewis said Edward Said emphasized academic study, politicized academic study of the East. Nevertheless, despite such criticism, the book remains a powerful analytical tool for understanding, analyzing the relationship between power, culture and representation. Now moving on to the next slide, significance of the work Orientalism. Said's work Orientalism provides the foundation for post-colonial studies, cultural studies. The book has influenced scholars like Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak and Homike Bhabha. For example, the book influenced Bhabha's concept of hybridity and mimicry, and it influenced Spivak's groundbreaking essay and idea, Can the Subaltern Speak? Furthermore, the work remains highly relevant in today's globalized world. In the context of intercultural conflicts, immigration, narratives, global media flows in today's world, the book remains influential. In addition, Orientalist discourse continues to persist. It influences narratives about Asia and the Middle East. For example, Western literature, travelogues, news channels, digital media and film produce stereotypical portrayals of the Middle East non-Western world, such as media coverage of Iraq, how Such media coverage is dependent on popular Western imagination about the East as exotic and dangerous and irrational places. So, popular media continues to circulate these images even today. Furthermore, such narratives shape not only academic knowledge but also public imagination. Such narrative influences public opinion and international policy. So, we find in post 9/11 media portrayals misrepresentations of Middle Eastern refugees and the war on terror narratives, for example American and British invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Similarly, commercial yoga, Ayurveda are depicted as mystical East in the Western world. Therefore, Oriental texts remain crucial for the critical analysis of representation, power relations. The book still remains influential. It is essential for understanding contemporary cultural politics and cultural understanding relationship. Now, on this slide, the application of Orientalism theory. Orientalism becomes useful for critical reading and analysis of European colonial texts. It reveals their colonial ideologies. It helps readers to detect and question ideological bias and literary text. The book Orientalism demonstrates how Eurocentric narratives continue to influence contemporary narratives. Said's theory of Orientalism help readers deconstruct dominant uneven cultural representation. The theory demonstrates the political nature of culture, political nature of cultural representation. The book also helps us understand how power operate through language and literature. Said's theory supports efforts to resist imperialist and racialized discourse in literature. Finally, Said's theory concept encourages the readers to be critical and put an emphasis on inclusive cultural understanding, cultural relationship, inclusive scholarship. So, his theory helped us identify ideological bias in text. In this sense, Said's concept of Orientalism is useful for critical reading and critical analysis of Oriental text, Western text. So, it is clear to conclude that Orientalism is more than a historical phenomenon. Orientalism emerged as a constructed Western framework that systematically imposes Western values on Eastern peoples and societies. Consequently, Orientalism shapes unequal power relations. Orientalist discourse is Eurocentric. So, Said's theory offers a powerful critique of Western representation assumption. Therefore, Said's theory encourages questioning of dominant narratives. Said unveils Orientalism's imperialistic attitudes and traditions. Orientalism is essential for understanding and interpreting modern cultural politics, as it raises questions about colonization, imperialism, racism and the construction of the other about the East embedded in literature, media, films and academia. Furthermore, it promotes critical thinking, it fosters critical awareness of ideological bias, it promotes inclusive scholarship, it advocates for balanced representation through cross-cultural awareness and decolonizing knowledge. Ultimately, Said called for more balanced, self-aware and inclusive scholarship that respects cultural complexity and diversity, and it deconstructs dominant Western perspective, assumptions and political authority. Now, on the further reading, you may explore these further readings. They deepen insight into Orientalism, its critiques and its significance its influence on modern post-colonial thought. So that's all for today, dear learners. Now I have completed the topic Orientalism. I hope this presentation has offered useful insights into the topic. I welcome any question, comments from you, and soon we will meet again with another video. Thank you so much for watching and listening.